at Jeong. I am pleased to invite Professor Max Koch at Lund University. Thank you for your participation to our program. He has worked on the ways in which and economic restructuring are reflected in welfare and employment relations, as well as in structure of social inequality. In recent 10 years, he combines this research interests with issues of ecological sustainability, particularly climate change, sustainable welfare, and degrowth post-growth societies. Today, he will give a presentation on the topic Pathways to Degrowth, Theoretical Discussion and Empirical Research. Professor Koch, you have 1 hour for presentation, followed by 30 minutes for floor discussion. So please let us hear your talk.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Now I learned the hard way that it is 7 hours time difference and not 8 as I thought beforehand. So I'm talking about pathways to degrowth, which is maybe a bit ambitious title, but I thought I present you some empirical and theoretical results from the last 5 years or so of my work. Well, this is what I'm talking about, the contents. I'll talk about, I start with the climate emergency, which is why I actually started to work about degrowth. I will mention some of the issues with the degrowth transformation, particularly about well-being, and tell you also a little bit what we do in Lund, a little bit to try to reduce the associated complexity in the societal transformation. And then I go over to discuss a little bit whether degrowth or something similar may be capable of becoming hegemonic. And that also brings me a little bit to the role of the state, to which about which I wrote recently a little bit. Well, and then there's plenty of time for discussion. So now I cannot move my presentation. It's not good. Oh, here. Yeah, I don't know, it works. So, well, you probably read about the last IPCC report from last week, so which didn't make it in this presentation here. Instead, I'm quoting here the Alliance of World Scientists, which calls for bold and drastic transformations within the ongoing decade. Also highlighted in unprecedentedly clear-cut terms that economic growth must be quickly curtailed to maintain long-term sustainability of the biosphere. The goals of economic and other policy making need to shift from GDP growth towards sustaining ecosystems and improving human well-being by prioritizing basic needs and reducing inequality. This is pretty much the program also of today's lecture, as you will see. This is this kind of statement by the Alliance of World Scientists, they are all natural scientists, echoes recent comparative empirical studies, which basically all say that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to absolutely decouple GDP growth from material resource use. Where this has been achieved, it was either in the short term only, or it has failed totally, and it hasn't happened at all on the global scale. And of course, if you think about problems such as climate change, you need to absolutely reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in absolute terms, and that significantly. I start off with one paper which came out already 6 years ago, which kind of shows you a little bit of the dilemma where we are. So absolute decoupling is not possible or likely in the future to come, which is why we have to think about sufficiency, or actually strategies that deprioritize economic growth. Here you see basically three clusters of parameters of, well, ecological sustainability, social inclusion, and quality of talking about social inclusion. For example, there is the Democracy Index, the Freedom House Index, and the Gini Index, measuring inequality on a very aggregate level. And there are also subjective or more individual measurements of the quality of life, such as, for example, life expectancy and subjective well-being. And then we have here divided the most part of the countries of the world, here 138 countries, into basically different clusters of GDP per capita in constant, in purchasing power parity currencies. So for example, if you have the poorest cluster, with countries including Chad and Uganda, actually a range of African countries, where people on average only earned 3,200 purchasing power parity dollars. That's per year, not per month. Then you have the next bracket, which we then call developing, the emerging, then the rich countries, where most of the countries that that we are, I think, belong to, where people earn between about $21,000 and $50,000 per year. For example, Sweden, Germany, where I'm original, I would reckon, I don't have the original data here right now, I would reckon that Korea is also there. And then you have a few statistical outliers, especially oil exporting countries such as Qatar, Kuwait, but also our neighbors here in Sweden, Norway, where people do earn a lot more, and they are. And in this cluster, you have only 8 countries, while in all the other countries, you have about 30. So now, if you look a little bit at the different indicators here, you see that this idea of the trickle-down effect, basically, you have to make the rich richer, and then the poorer will also get something. What is it? Shall I answer to the chat?
Yeah, can you?
PowerPoint does not move. Fix that first slide. Oh, yeah. I don't know. Maybe I can try to. Sorry, I stopped sharing for a minute, and then I try it not in presentation mode. Maybe that works. Can you see that?
Yeah. Can you try to move?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that works now.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, well, sorry. Yeah, thanks for letting me know. I would have gone on with that because it worked on my screen, and not. I don't know why. Yeah. Okay. Well, the long story short, the richer the countries get in terms of GDP per capita, the higher, the longer the life expectancies, the higher the subjective well-being. Also, if you do not consider for a second the overdeveloped countries, they even get more equal. So the Gini index goes actually down. The richer the countries get on average, the happier people are. even the more equal are, the freer they are, as far as that is measured by the Democracy and Freedom House expert. But if you also look at the ecological sustainability indicators, the story does unfortunately not hold. The richer the countries get, the, so to speak, dirtier they are also. And if you just look at the rich countries here, like Australia, Denmark, Sweden, or Germany, I suppose also Korea, as I said, the ecological footprint in both production and consumption would need to go down by something like 2/3 to 3/4 in order to bring economies and societies within planetary boundaries. So this is why I think that there is actually no alternative to degrowth. Instead of hoping for, well, something that hasn't happened in 30 years now, an effective absolute decoupling of GDP growth and environmental resource indicators, we need to tackle these issues direct if we basically want to survive. If we want to effectively mitigate the climate emergency. And I dare say that if you prefer the term socialism to degrowth, that is absolutely fine to me, but it cannot be a socialism of the 20th century. At least if you think about, I think, the bulk of 20th century Marxists who were actually thinking of surpassing the capitalist countries of the time by producing even more GDP growth than in the capitalist world. So the 21st century socialism would need to be one where the, what did Marx call them, associated producers come together and basically well, organize societal use of resources and of course labor that brings about a shrinking matter and energy throughput, and that would need to start relatively soon. Well, I'm not talking of socialism here so much. I think you have other people to do that, but about degrowth. But I'm also happy to read, and let me say that there seems to be a conversion going on between the two movements. If I think of a very recent article in Monthly Review, which I think was called Eco-Social Degrowth or Ecological Socialist Degrowth, something like that. Well, that would be good. Anyway, these are the main features. One of our postdocs, Tim Parikh, who wrote about 1,000-page PhD about the political economy of degrowth, highly recommendable, tells me there are over 100 different definitions of degrowth at the moment. And also here, the good news is apparently that they seem to be converging. And so what I take here as core features of degrowth, what I hope most people in the degrowth camp sign up to. So first of all, the economy would need to be looked at as a biophysical process and not so much as a process where, well, sums of money get bigger, or in Marxist terms, if you want, rather in use value terms than in exchange value terms. It is about reducing the matter and energy throughput in both production and consumption in order to meet planetary boundaries. That shrinking process is supposed to be democratic. That means it is not to be some kind of dictatorship of any kind, but should come from the, well, from the bottom up, so to speak, in different ways. And while this is going on, this shrinking process, there should also be less inequality, whilst well-being levels should be maintained at critical levels. There are other degrowthers who are even more optimistic than that, when they say that that human well-being should even increase during that. So I have my doubts whether that is achievable in the short term, at least. In the short term, it will be probably about maintaining critical levels of well-being. But we all know what the alternative would mean. A business as usual scenario, read the last IPCC report from last week, would undermine the living conditions of, well, the bulk of regions of the world, with associated implications, negative implications for well-being levels across the board. So in the long term, well-being levels will only be stabilized if we actually initiate some kind of degrowth process. And of course, there is a geographical, or if you want to, a social note here too. So this should start, this degrowth process, in the global north, basically in the countries that I have lived in. I lived in Germany, in Great Britain, and Sweden, with a short spell in Chile, but by using a lot less in those countries that are historically responsible for the problem, for the climate emergency and associated ecological crisis. That should actually open up a space for development, but I guess for an alternative development in global South countries. So I can also say from the beginning that, you know, I have stopped flying about 10 years ago, which has the side effect that I don't get around very much. So I'm talking this today, especially for my part of the world, which is Europe, and especially Western Europe. So I think I have made the point. While I think that degrowth, broadly understood as a downsizing of the matter and energy throughput in production and consumption patterns, is necessary. But necessary does not mean it is easy. And this is something we should also talk about. I'm actually a sociologist, and with my colleague Milena Büchs, I've looked at that, what that would actually mean for existing social structures, degrowth transition. At the example of well-being, because well-being is very often cited as something. Well, if you think about social systems, you might call them, or social fields, like, for example, the political system, the welfare state especially, which is historically responsible for the relatively high levels of well-being in Western countries. They all have evolved in parallel with the post-war, I mean the post-World War period, where in the Fordist accumulation model, production and consumption norms grew in parallel, and they grew very quickly. So as you probably know, in the 50s and 60s, and also parts of the 70s, in Western Europe anywhere, there was full employment, which brought the trade unions in a relatively good negotiation position vis-a-vis capital. But capital, on the other hand, made also good profits, healthy profits, if you want, because there was a huge demand for everything that could be produced on a mass production level, including televisions, refrigerators, etc. So if you have this double movement of quickly rising profits and real wages, there is a third institution that is also happy, and that was the state, which at the time was basically, in the first place, a national state, which could tax the primary incomes from both capital and labor to fund, among other things, of course, the welfare systems and the welfare state we are now used to, and the deregulation of which we actually have been discussing in the last 30 years or so. But what is here important here is basically that these different social systems, as well system theorists would call it, societal fields, as Bourdieu would call it, they are interrelated, and they are semi-autonomous in a way, but they have developed in a particular political economic constellation. And if you now basically take away basically the economic base, so to say, for all this economic growth, then this will have implications for all these systems that have developed in tandem with it. And so degrowth would need to find a way that a range of social systems would need to change, and they would need to change in roughly the same direction and roughly at the same speed. Otherwise, we get what the classic of sociology, Emile Durkheim, called anomie. Anomie is basically a lack of basically connection between different areas of society, very often leading to unemployment and other kinds of crisis. And of course, that has implications for well-being. So that was basically the system level. But there is also, if you think about changing basically everything, well, there's also the kind of agency level. And we could take whoever we want, for example, Marx and Bourdieu. As you all, I guess, know very well, the basics of capitalism do not appear in the particular historical way as they have evolved and are reproduced, but they basically are perceived at the natural way. This brings me back to the 1980s when we read Marx in reading courses at the time, and when you go through Capital, basically, you always have three things. You have economic categories, you have social relations, and you have modes of consciousness. And right from the commodity form through to at the end of the third volume, when you talk about the trinitary formula, basically you see what we called at the time and what I have recently written about again. It is a kind of step ladder of mystifications, which is at the end of which you have, what was it, Madame La Terre and Monsieur Le Capital, and everything looks perfectly natural. And there's basically no way to look through this. People feel like fishes in the water, and it is very difficult to actually establish alternatives because of that mystification process that are inherent in the capitalist economic forms and associated social relations. But so if that is true for the production range, and then if you also take Bourdieu or other cultural sociologists, but especially Bourdieu, you find actually that also in consumption relations, you have the same going on. Differences in consumption, which, as Bourdieu showed famously, are associated to class relations, appear to be differences of individual taste. In German, we say, über Geschmack spricht man nicht. You don't talk about taste. Taste is supposed to be one of the most individual things you can think about. Well, you need a sociological analysis to tell people otherwise. And his ideology critique, it goes even further than that of Marx, which I've also wrote about recently, in that he says basically the social order including the growth imperative, it is set actually in our bones. It is inscribed in our bodies. That means beyond forms of consciousness, as the traditional ideology theory talked about. So the growth paradigm itself, which was masterfully analyzed by Marx, I think, starting from the commodity form in general, but then and money, but then specifically in his discussion of relative surplus value, which basically leaves no alternatives for individual capitalists than to expand the overall step ladder of production, to expand companies. That all of that comes to be perceived as the natural way of basically organizing economy and society. So growth, expansion, capitalism, profit are analyzed, can be analyzed in these terms, but tend to be perceived at the individual level in terms of progress, career success, status, cost and benefit calculations, individualism, and of course, competition. So just as the transformation of a range of societal systems is difficult, so it is at the level of individuals and the values, their habitus, structures that keeps them going. I think I can leave that a little bit shorter. Within degrowth, we discussing well-being quite conversely. A lot of people sign up to the idea that happiness does not happiness level, subjective well-being level, do not increase in parallel with GDP growth. So, conclude from that if you reduced a GDP, happiness levels would remain the same, so that happiness or subjective well-being levels are basically unlinked to GDP growth. So I'm a little bit more cautious there. We thought that maybe in the first table that I was showing, that actually subjective well-being levels indeed are linked to GDP per capita. So what we don't really know, because no one has ever tried degrowth, is basically how well-being levels would move in the short term. It could be, as psychologists say, that the pain from loss is actually bigger than the pleasure from gain. So, for example, they have done studies on lottery winners, which showed after a while the same well-being levels as before, whilst people that lost a limb, maybe a leg or an arm in a tragical accident, actually featured lower well-being levels also in the longer term. And there's finally, and that is, I think, important to mention within social science circle, there's a methodological problem, I think, with this paradigm, in that GDP can, in principle, grow indefinitely. There's always a bigger amount of money than the last one, so to speak, whilst subjective well-being is measured on a bounded scale, usually from 0 to 10. People are asked, how happy are you all after analyzing your entire life, and then they put a 7 or something. And then you have countries, especially in Scandinavia, where you have already 8 or 9 or something, which is basically difficult to top. So basically what you do here, you compare one unbounded thing with a bounded thing, and that is methodologically problematic. So not least due to that, I and a range of other people tend to prioritize objective well-being indicators, and here we are in the area of human needs. Now basically two human need theories, all from the early 1990s. There's Donald Doyle and Guth and Max Neef, which we, as I said, tell you in a minute, look at to basically understand, first of all, the intersection between the environment and welfare as an important area for well-being. Looking at that intersection helps basically reducing the overall complexity associated with the degrowth transition. And it also helps because needs are basically understood as being the same over time and across space. So that it kind of allows a dialogue with future generation, even because we just assume that even those who come after us in 50 or 100 years, there will still be a need, for example, for clear water and similar things. So we call this in research projects here at Lund, we call this intersection of welfare and environment, sustainable welfare. And it is most generally defined as meeting human needs within environmental limits. But universally, that means of all people and not only the happy few in the West now and in future. Yeah. One person we use there quite often is the Chilean economist Manfred Max Neef, you know, who has a catalog of basically universal needs. I don't go through them in fundamental human needs, he calls them, in the detail. But what is important basically is that is not so much that these needs exist and must be satisfied. Otherwise, people experience what Ian Guth called serious harm. It is also important to look at the way they are satisfied, and that is basically how we approach in a range of products that whilst you have universal needs in the sense that in all societies, in whatever societal with whatever the societal organization, you need to make sure that people are fed, that they are in good health, that there is time for autonomy, that they are able to create things, etc., etc. But the way how historical societies and also different societies today satisfy these needs is very different. And this is important for sustainability discourses. So we are discussing what Max Neef called needs satisfiers, which can be more or less environmentally friendly. And in some circumstances, they can also be synergetic in the sense that one need satisfier basically satisfied not just one basic need, but several. Well, and then this together with this kind of ideas coming from Rockström and others at the Stockholm Resilience Center gives us some idea where economies and societies, whatever their organization maybe, should well move towards. No? You have on the one hand the planetary boundaries as identified by the Stockholm Resilience Center. There are, I think, 11, and 4 of them we have exceeded already. Then there are a few others where we are on the way of doing that. And then there's also this inner boundary, which is important. Yeah, that is the minimum that the minimum social resources and economic resources necessary for needs satisfaction at that sufficiency level. And in between that is what, for example, Ray Walls calls the safe operating space as a scale and target for eco-social policies. Other people who have written about that include Julie Hirvilami from France and Ian Gough from the UK. So all that is very relevant for degrowth circles. As you can see, the next questions I raise is whether actually such ideas can become hegemonic. We can discuss a certain eco-social policies. That these are policies that not only do something about inequality, but also about environmental sustainability. And we can discuss a few and whether they may help us to basically reach that safe operating space between the planetary and sufficiency levels. So there are some policies that are oriented at the inner boundary of that circle I just saw, or the sufficiency level, for example, basic income, but also basic services. Now, that depends a little bit on the welfare regime also. So there are different ways that, that people can be assured, or citizens can be assured of not basically falling through that lower boundary. Basic services could, for example, include free education. It could mean cheap social housing or affordable social housing, but maybe also the provision of internet spaces for everybody for not much money. And then there are policies that would need to be targeted at that economy and societies basically remain within the outer or the planetary boundaries. These include, for example, caps on incomes and wealth. So society would define a maximum of money beyond which the state would tax 100%. And that could be applied to both income and wealth, and would do something about inequality. If you think about that, the richest 1% and also the richest 10%, but especially the richest 1%, have far outsized climate greenhouse gas emissions and have far outsized footprints of consumption and production, then such policies would not only do something about inequality, but also about sustainability if that resulting extra tax income would be invested into, well, for example, social housing or environmentally friendly politics. But of course, you can also offer less radical, so to say, policies such as taxation of wealth, but also a limitation of certain things. Meat consumption, for example. You could limit the living space per individual or the number of flights, or make a combination of that. Well, then we can look a little bit how popular such ideas are. Yeah, we made a representative analysis of that, a representative study of that in Sweden last year. And you see that, at the sufficiency level, that means policies that are oriented to make sure that people can meet their basic needs. They are, well, in some cases popular, such as free public transport, for example. But in the case of a free food basket or a basic income, they are in Sweden rather unpopular. Only 21% would like to introduce that at the moment. We may discuss why that is, but I don't think I have the time for it. It has to do with an especially strong Protestant work ethic in Sweden anyway. And then when you look at the upper levels of the safe operating space, the planetary boundaries, well, a cap on income and wealth is supported by just 27%, whilst over 50% are against it. And that is, of course, interesting because we made a rough calculation. Only between 1% and 2% of the Swedish population would actually be affected by such a policy. But still, so many people think that is a bad idea. We may think here again about Marx and Bourdieu and the idea that the economic order is something natural, and that you just do not fuss with the rich, otherwise the poor will suffer too. But of course, that is not directly in the data. But it gives you some idea how strongly inscribed, the capitalist order with its associated inequality and threatening ecological footprint is basically inscribed in our way of thinking, and Bourdieu would say even in our bodies. And very similar it is with the idea of limitation of the number of flights per year, no matter how rich you are. People don't want that. 60% say you cannot do that. And even worse, so to speak, is the idea of limiting space per person. And all these are policies, ideas that most ecological economists would think that is really a good idea. Yeah, but still 70% of the population in Sweden would not sign up to such an idea. Well, we can also look at that a little bit more theoretically advanced terms. This is here a Bourdieusian idea. You probably remember the graphs from distinction, where people are classes are built according to the volume and the structure of what Bourdieu calls cultural and economic capital. Basically, Bourdieu says that we must understand people's actions, people's ways of thinking as a kind of result of three things: of objective positions in social space that tend to correspond with certain dispositions, and then active position takings, for example, in questions of policies, in my case, eco-social policies. So basically, if you construct the Swedish population in these kind of terms, and then you see a little bit how this all hangs together, I don't have time to talk about this in the detail either. I just want to say that basically we would be interested in this ball here on the top left corner, active sustainable welfare. These are people, about 20 to 25% of the population, that would even think about doing and would support the kind of changes that ecological economists as well as degrowth think are necessary. You have a few others, like the environmental centralists and the fossil liberals, who sign up to some of the eco-social agenda, but not to others, especially that are rather eco-friendly, but would not do anything that would basically increase social inequality. And they would especially not fuss with economic growth. So this is basically the situation right now. And then you have another 40 to 45% of people which are not at all objectively, structurally reachable for basically social and ecological transformations that I think both Marxists and degrowthers would like to see, at least if we talk about eco-social Marxists. Well, so this is a rather depressing message in many ways. So if you give me another 10 minutes or so to finish up my talk, or maybe 15 minutes. You said I have an hour, right? So, but I can stop at any minute. Do I have another 15 minutes or so?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Yeah. All right. So that brings me back to the can degrowth or eco-socialism. I don't think we have to. We can actually emphasize here more what the two have in common than what may keep them apart, because most of the population wouldn't want either. And I don't think it would be considerably different in Korea than in Sweden, with some, of course, changes. Well, what can we say from a social science perspective? What are the potentials for structural change that I remind you would need to happen within this decade? Otherwise, we run into climate hell. Well, in many ways, Bourdieu's turn on structure and agency is a 20th century update from Marx's famous quote from the 18th Brumaire. You remember now that we make history, we act actively, but unfortunately not under conditions of our own choosing, but within circumstances, and I quote very freely, that are already there and that constrain our actions very much. And basically, Bourdieu's idea of positions, dispositions, position takings, of a structured habitus by the social structures, especially by classes, but not only, that then tends to structure in turn social practices that unfortunately have the tendency to reproduce the original social structure. What can we say about this kind of circle to break? Well, if we follow Bourdieu for a while longer, then what usually happens, that means when economy and society is not in crisis, then practice is guided by habitus, and society is not questioned or only by, a few academics. The growth paradigm itself is basically a kind of a pensée unique, something you just don't question, that is part of life, just as the air we breathe. In a crisis, Bourdieu was thinking especially of economic crisis, but here we could basically also think about the multivariate crisis we are in at the moment, which is an economic crisis and a social crisis with exploding inequality, and of course the ecological crisis. We can discuss a little bit what that makes with the habitus. Well, Bourdieu himself said that two things happen at the same time. One thing is what he referred to 20 years ago as because increasingly more people question it, and while that is happening, the dominant try to defend their privileges in many ways, and using not cultural hegemony as Gramsci would have it, but now the police, for example, and the legal system and whatever, and basically change the rule of the game representative democracy themselves. But it is also the time, as Bourdieu had it, and you find very similar ideas, for example, in Poulantzas and Gramsci. It is also the time where heterodox thought becomes more popular and alternatives, societal alternatives such as degrowth or eco-socialism basically gain ground. And what really will happen, we don't know. I can only talk about Europe here. It looks a bit like the orthodoxy is more strong, which would basically defend the Western way of life, otherwise called the imperial mode of living by Ulrich Brandt. By authoritarian means, that means basically they would defend our right to fly wherever we want and to eat 10 schnitzels a day, basically to the last day, and using all their military might, so that won't change. And then there's the alternative that we all want to see, which is a social ecological transformation, which can happen as a result of a combination of objective crisis and what Bourdieu called counter-training. So what people opt for in the current multiple crises, and I haven't even mentioned the COVID-19 crisis here, which we also have, will partly depend on available policy offers. And in degrowth, we kind of tend to emphasize, but I would think that should be true also for eco-socialists. It is about basically creating and expanding spaces, societal spaces where the growth imperative ceases to what Castoriadis once called colonize imaginaries, basically the discourses, the way we think, the way we interact with each other, and basically establish alternative forms of basically treating each other as equals and not based on elbows and competition. And what we do in our work here in Lund is, for example, to carry out citizen forums where we and this brings me back to the needs approach, basically where we discuss and critically reflect with the people on the ground. How do you actually satisfy your basic needs? How could you do that in an utopian different world? And thirdly, how could you get from A to B? So that means we deliberate what we call eco-social policies in a range of areas. That is very important that you have the two together. If you only have environmental policies, for example, it's a good idea, I thought, in your newsletter that you have a lot of British people following your lecture sequence here. Well, if you brought all British houses to Swedish insulation standard, that's probably a good idea from a mere climate perspective. But if you think about that, most British house owners are already now indebted. And you ask them to put up a solar panel for, I don't know, another £10,000 and insulate your houses for still another 20,000. You can imagine for what kind of government these people will vote for the next time round. No? It's not Jeremy Corbyn, but unfortunately the alternative, or whatever the successor of Corbyn is called. And in these kind of ways, you have to go through a range of policies and make sure that they are implemented in egalitarian ways. I meant to talk a little bit more, but I keep this now very short to allow you a discussion, to talk a little bit more of our citizen forums, which we see as these kind of societal spaces where people, so to speak, reoccupy their lives, their work, and their society. And this is only a kind of a very rough selection of things that people would like to see here in the Swedish. They want to see more non-commercial meeting places, both physical and digital. At least in our forums, the idea of a universal basic income was more popular, but they would also like to see universal basic services. So this has a stronger tradition in Sweden, with a traditional, relatively generous welfare system. They would like to see working hour reductions and also a cap on wealth and income. So basically what they would like to also to say state support for social enterprises, basically enterprises that do not work on a for-profit for-profit principle. They would like to see more affordable housing, spaces that facilitate intergenerational living, and they would also like to see a complementation of the existing representative democracy with more direct and deliberative elements such as citizen forums. So this is basically something that also, for example, Extinction Rebellion would like to see, and a range of other climate activists, these so-called climate citizen assemblies. The idea is, if you really talk with people what the situation is like, and if you take away all the capitalist ideology, well, maybe a few more people will start questioning them. But you really have to create the spaces, and you have to bring them together for a while so that they can, so to speak, get beyond what their habitus has told them for their whole life, basically to break through that and to start interacting in different ways, see the other not as a competitor, but as a partner in order to basically mitigate climate change and establish a more just social order. Well, if this goes well and ecological and social policies are deliberated, I argue then it is possible to also bring them into state policies as we have them at various levels. I leave that maybe a little bit shorter here. I wrote about the state because in more than in Marxism, maybe in the environmental movement, there is a very big animosity, so to speak, towards the state. Is also always seen as a kind of opponent. But then when you actually look at what degrowthers very often postulate, then it is a policy such as a universal basic income, working time reduction, many other, that typically governments push through. Well, so this is a bit what states should do, governments, no? That is, we could look at government policies in terms of economic development, spatial targets, no? In terms of critical and Marxist geographers, and at eco-social policies. So we should regard economic development not so much as a valuation process, but as biophysical process, and oriented at the provision of use values that are capable of serving as sustainable needs satisfiers that can help ensuring that production and consumption patterns evolve actually within the safe operating space and do not exceed environmental limits. At the same time, they would allow that people don't fall below the sufficiency level that I've talked about. This would probably need to be done in a kind of division of labor between global and local levels. So the state rescaling discussion, which is very popular in geography, would need to be applied here. It would be at the global level that identification, that thresholds for matter and energy throughput would need to be identified. And we would need to leave it to local and maybe national levels to see what kind of economies that may suggest. and definitely a different division of labor, of private market, state, and collective or communal enterprises than we have now. So with a much stronger case basically for communal properties, and maybe in a transition phase also state properties. Well, I think here I probably tell you not so much new things here. It is worthwhile, but probably more popular among Marxists to look at the particular interaction of state and civil society, how it looks like at the moment. But I would argue that is good to combine with the Weberian tradition, so to speak, looking a bit more at the historical differentiation of it, and the Bourdieusian interpretation of that here is very important, emphasizing symbolic domination. But of course, as you know from Poulantzas, for example, in principle, civil society mobilization can be used to build and expand what he called centers of opposition within the state apparatus, or what Bourdieu calls the left hand of the state. And that could then, of course, help develop the eco-social policies we want to see, resulting in something we may call a virtuous circle of sustainable welfare. I just look at, if you give me 2 extra minutes, at some critical areas, I think, for further research. And I don't think only for degrowthers, but far beyond that. So one thing is, this is also one of the projects I lead at the moment, is to understand how welfare systems can be actually made growth independent. As I showed you in one of the graphs, welfare states have emerged in parallel with economic growth and are presently very much dependent on it. On the other hand, welfare systems are critical for basically making sure that people can meet their basic needs. So it is crucial to kind of develop welfare systems, and I say systems, not necessarily states here, that can do that job whilst being independent from growth. That means also when growth is being reduced. We need to know more about how single eco-social policies can actually be integrated so that virtuous policy circle actually arises. That is far from easy. We would need to think what kind of policies may have what E.O. Wright called ruptural potential, and may be prioritized within a strategy of social ecological transformations. And I think our discussions of Hubert Buchansen's and my discussion of caps on income and wealth may be a good candidate here. Then finally, we have the temporal aspect. We would need to see basically what kind of policies would need to be implemented immediately. That means in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, in the midterm, including a phase out of the most emissions-intensive industries, and long-term, those that basically have the potential of transforming the capitalist growth economy towards one that emphasizes the provisioning of use values serving as sustainable needs satisfiers. So in conclusion, green growth is unlikely to happen, and degrowth is necessary to address the climate emergency and re-embed economy and society and planetary limits. Degrowth here understood basically as a planned reduction of matter and energy throughput. The sustainable welfare focus may help And I think it does help to reduce the enormous amount of complexity associated with the degrowth transition. We have never had a societal transition of that caliber under democratic auspices. And we would need to do that now and very soon. The current multidimensional crisis of capitalism may favor circumstances where the customary correspondence of social structure, habitus, and practices break and deliver inroads for what Bourdieu has called counter-training, and for which I made the example of the of the deliberate citizens forums. And of course, we need to think how we co-develop eco-social policies at various levels. So for the, I should say, local, national, and transnational levels. Yeah, well, I hope you enjoyed that a little bit. If you're interested in this kind of work, I think you can look up the range of publications where part of what I've been talking about are actually developed in much more detail. Many thanks for listening, and sorry for talking a little bit too long, I think. I'm sure the presentation can be shared afterwards, so that should you be interested in reading these publications, you can try. Otherwise, you're welcome to contact me, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your very interesting and insightful presentation, Professor Koch. I think you showed us the strategy and path to degrowth, which is well supported by various and abundant theoretical and empirical discussion. Now, anyone who has any questions or discussion on the presentation, please raise your hand or let me know via chat. 네, 정동민 선생님.
Professor Max Koch, thank you very much. It's a great talk. I learned very much from your talk on the pathways for degrowth. I especially learned from your policy suggestions in terms of the eco-social policies regarding the inner and outer boundaries. So, yeah, my question, I have a very simple question. So you mentioned about degrowth, and you also mentioned that degrowth will be compatible with the plus GDP growth. So, what do you think? So, what actually is the GDP? Yeah, as you rightly indicated, common peoples are all think growth in terms of the GDP growth. So when we talk about degrowth, we usually understand it as the minus growth or zero growth. But it looks that you mean degrowth as some kind of the very toxic suppression of some is unproductive or the is environmentally harmful sectors growth. But as we all know that we really need the growth of some essential part, as we experienced in the difficult period of COVID. We very in some essential items we really need the growth of that sectors. So, but anyways, so GDP many people are still is believed, or yeah, they are they have some kind of the GDP illusions. So, do you think so anyway, yeah, it will be great if you could be more precise about the exact meaning of degrowth.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I hope I understood it correct, but I can try to clarify what I meant. It is in degrowth, we would like to see basically an emphasis on different parameters than monetary ones. We would like to see, and if you want, also measure the economy and production and consumption together in different terms. If you rather use value terms than exchange value terms. So we would if we were to plan a society and we could do that, we would need to identify certain thresholds for energy and matter consumption, like ecological economists do that. That is what we would like to see, and I think we will need to have something like that, whatever you call it. I hope it is not in the form of rationing, and I would hope that we have it in an as egalitarian way as possible. What I also showed, and what I think most degrowthers agree on, is that so far empirically we have a quite close link between the development of GDP and these environmental indicators we are interested in. So if that kind of decoupling, and I don't think this decoupling can be established at the rate that would be necessary, for example, to meet the Paris Agreement targets. It is likely that if we manage to kind of transform the production and consumption processes in a way that maximum levels of energy and matter throughput are not superseded as it is now, then that would probably coincide with negative growth as we have it at the moment. But it would be actually part of the, so to speak, counter hegemony or the counter training to deprioritize GDP growth also as a main measurement for the success of entire governments and societies. And it is at the moment, of course, I totally agree. If a government has failed these days, if it hasn't produced something like 2% of GDP growth, whatever that means, yeah, as you know perfectly well, that doesn't actually tell us very much because it can be down to, for example, the spilling of oil or something. Yeah, and I absolutely agree that this is, and I hope I made that point, that this is a colossal challenge to basically dethrone growth as the main steering principle for our societies. In more Marxist terms, you could also say it is basically dethroning the profit principle.
Thank you.
I don't know, I hope I have answered a little bit what you otherwise come back and.
Yes, Professor Saito.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm also recently advocating the fusion of eco-socialism and degrowth. So it was very interesting to hear your lecture today. And I would like to share some of common critiques that I often get here in Japan. Actually, I do research in Japan, and I have a little bit different background. But anyway, so people, when people talk about, or when people hear about degrowth, they usually react that, okay, so climate emergency is very pressing today, and we need a rapid transformation, and the decoupling is not happening and will not be happening in the near future. So that's why we say we need degrowth. But the problem is that we also need a lot of time to make a transition to a degrowth kind of society. So within 20 or 30 years, that requires a fundamental shift. Degrowth is also too slow, too time consuming. So, you know, we criticize growth, people, green growth, and it's a myth, etc. But the degrowth as an alternative is not compelling either. So how would you respond to that kind of criticism? Because your presentation basically suggested even people like Sweden, you know, for Japanese people, Sweden is like a socialist country, but even those people are still against basic income and limitation of the housing space, etc. So how would you react to that kind of critique? And my second question related to that point is, so if people don't understand this necessity of regulating some of our ecological burdens in a way that we really need to impose certain kind of regulation from above. You know, during the COVID, we have to do lockdowns and etc. even without consent from the people. We cannot really say, okay, we're gonna do this, and there's some people against it, and we don't have time to discuss those things under the emergency. So you know, your colleague like Andreas Mann talks about this kind of chronicle emergency where we need war communism, and we, you know, a kind of new Leninism whatsoever. This is kind of absurd, but I also understand when, you know, degrowth is not democratically happening and green growth is myth, that we just have to do certain kind of strict measure. So how would you respond to Malmö's suggestion of ecological Leninism or whatsoever? And relating to that, how do you characterize yourself as also a kind of eco-socialist? And what would be the role of a market in your vision of degrowth?
That a lot of questions and very crucial questions. I hope I didn't produce the appearance that I have answers to all of them. I was basically leading you to some of the issues that we are grappling with, and they are basically getting worse by the day. I was trying in the end of also that a lot of what I said, I think, goes for eco-socialist and degrowthers, to be honest. But the temporal logic is probably quite important. We would need to have some kind of agreement what to do in the immediate future, and then create a kind of common denominator about that, and then going on. And we need a way of basically stopping many of the fossil fuel emittents that are in operation now, and that will only go well against the interest of the rich. So I think within the degrowth movement, I am one who has always emphasized the existence of classes of very powerful interests that that we will have to fight against. A degrowth society won't become about like a degrowth conference. So, but we on the one hand, I do think we have to learn ways of interacting with each other in certain, you can call it artificial spaces within capitalism, to actually create and develop the ideas how it could work at a higher level or a higher scale. And I would be a bit cautious in selling here a general principle, but I do think we can learn from some of the experiences of the socialist countries in Europe. Also from the problems with planning, with central. If you think about the work from Alec Knopf, for example, who was one in the 1980s. It was maybe before your time. One of the. But I think you probably read him. One of the people who basically from the ground, not only, and that is what Marx was so good at, basically arguing why markets and capitalism is unproductive. It is an immense waste of resources, but on the other hand, it is not so easy. And as far as I know, Marx did not leave us so much of a clue about how to avoid this waste by basically giving everything to the associated producers. And I think he didn't want to basically precedent future class struggles. But this is probably something we'll have to discuss again, both in eco-socialist circle and also in degrowth. And I think you are reading the new manuscripts from Mega and other things. So I'm a bit off that. I don't know whether we can expect much more knowledge from Marx himself about these issues. But as long as we don't have it, I think we need to a bit pragmatically find divisions of labors between states, market, the non-profit sectors that have the advantage that they already exist, but that balance between them would of course need to be changed with a much stronger role for the non-profit sector and non-profit enterprises. But there's also a past dependency here, yeah. In one paper by my colleague Hubert Buchansen about degrowth trajectories is that probably the state would play a bigger role in degrowth trajectories in the Nordic countries, I mean in the Scandinavian countries, where you have a tradition of state regulation in welfare and inequality much stronger, for example, than in countries with a liberal tradition, UK, US, others. And so that would probably survive, so that you would probably have different combinations or different divisions of labor, of market, state, and non-profit sector, the commons, very important here, in different parts of the world. And you would also have different divisions of labor of scale, whether what can be in degrowth, you have a preference for basically doing as much as possible on local levels. But that already Alec Knopf said that basically about feasible socialism. Maybe we should write a book about feasible degrowth now.
I have so many things to ask, but I don't know what. It's been hard for me to visit Europe in the last couple of years because of the COVID. So I wonder, the atmosphere in Europe is actually changing toward more degrowth sympathetic. For example, after Greta Thunberg's sort of influence, do you think? It seems that at least as I see in the Twitter and like Facebook and so on, it seems that more people are, especially in, Jason Hickel or you and Alf Huambo, and people are talking about degrowth more explicitly. And it was a surprise for me in this monthly review issue that Michel Levy is actually co-authoring this paper with Yorgos Karis. And especially because I had some conversation with Michel, and he was generally very critical of the idea of degrowth because he thinks that a lot of things actually have to grow, and degrowth gives a very misleading impression that everything needs to shrink, and that's not what we want, etc. But he actually now seems to endorse the idea of degrowth. So I'm wondering what's actually happening in Europe or in Western countries recently.
And I did not answer your comment on Andreas Malm either.
Yeah, that's tricky also.
Let's say I would hope that what Andreas Malm describes won't be necessary, but I think it is. It's getting more likely that basically it doesn't really look like that we get this kind of bottom-up pressure together to kind of carry out the kind of changes that are necessary, which sooner or later will, then it is probably not war communism, but then some kind of authoritarian dealing with this, and it will be not an egalitarian one. That I think I have tried to outline this with Europe first, as I call it, but you can call it Korea or Japan first too. But anyway, where you have a new kind of rationing system, but only for those who will be seen as worth living, which won't be the majority. And and your second question, there is, and I also try to, with this first Bourdieu graph, I wanted to show this too. There is definitely more interest for these kind of issues. I can just say from my own work, 10 years ago, I would still have been regarded as a lunatic with my stuff in official academic circles, with degrowth also. With Marxists also, they got used to that. There are some people like that still, always will be, but you don't fuss with economic growth and anything like that. And that has changed for a while. I got, for example, this issue with the welfare systems. We just got money for that project because we made the argument, well, even if it doesn't really matter whether we want more growth or not, maybe we don't actually have it due to other crises, that capitalism will not be able to generate the kind of growth rates we have seen in the past. So it is kind of a pragmatic move to see how we can basically manage without growth anyway. So we presented it a bit in that way, that actually beyond degrowth hippies, there's actually a broader interest in these kind of issues, and you can make some leeway with that kind of argument. But of course it is still, and I also saw now, because for another panel next week, I actually read now some of the IPCC report, the last one, and I can also see there, I don't know whether you had the chance to read it in some detail but you find actually a lot more reference to degrowth solutions there. Not a degrowth scenario, which we would actually also need, but in various chapters it is referred to it, and so in some way there is a little bit of a well, we have shattered a little bit the hegemony, I think, a little bit, but I wouldn't overestimate that. And yeah, sure. I think I have tried to show what should shrink, and this is of course not everything, but we definitely not need aggregate GDP growth. We need much less, and I'm talking about the global north, and I hope I made that clear enough. We need much less use of energy and matter resources, and I think also the 21st century so grapple with that. It is not a socialism kind of sources opponents as in my youth. I grew up in West Berlin. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Koch. Can you hear me? It was an interesting speech, especially because of which welfare can be reduced to complexity during transition. And the well-being index can be the instrument of empirical study. And this is a kind of review comment, small kind of review comment. I think the pathways for degrowth you said can be useful in Korea because there's a lot of projects which systems are in crisis, need an alternative in Korea, like dissolve long hour labor regime, familiarization of labor production, demographic cliff more than green growth. I think it could be a alternative pathway for a social reproduction project in Korea. And it was really interesting that well-being index could be replace the GDP index. Thank you for your good speech.
I have thanks so much that you liked it. There's something I'm grappling with myself, which I was thinking of pointing to you. May be a bit stronger on Marx as I'm right now, and it's the issue of needs, which came to be quite central in these transformation discourses. And from how I remembered it, and I don't have the latest mega publications at my proposal here to check it myself, is that he didn't too much discuss needs in a way, maybe in his early writings, but left that a little bit to the use value side that does not really need to be discussed and so that the quite crucial difference we make today between wants and needs in English, or in German Bedürfnis and Grundbedürfnis, that you did not really find that, but I may be wrong there. And if you can point me to some of Marx's work which can bring me further there, I would be grateful. So we need to avoid basically to the neoclassical point of view, where everything ends up in consumer sovereignty. Basically, you don't discuss that. Needs and wants are the same, and we won't get any further in any sustainability debate if we can find that. But of course, it's a difficult issue. That's why we started again with Doyle and Goff and Max Neef and so on. But sorry, it was only one thing. You may have other questions.
Okay, if there is no more questions or discussion, I think it's time to close our seminar. Thank you for your presentation and discussion, Professor Koch, and thank you all. The next talk will be made on the day after tomorrow, April 14th, not Wednesday, but Thursday at 7 p.m. Professor Liam Campling at Queen Mary University of London will give a presentation under the topic of pelagic imperialism in the 21st century, East Asia and the political economy of marine fisheries. I hope to see you all then. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Goodbye. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.